Welcome to Carbon Compass, where we explore meaningful conversations around driving South Africa towards a more sustainable future. This podcast is brought to you by Brundtland, where we use our in-house expertise to break down complex climate and sustainability topics in a way that is accessible and actionable. Brundtland is a purpose-built consultancy committed to empowering people to create a sustainable planet. We help key stakeholders navigate the complexities of a carbon-constrained world while balancing the needs of today with the ability of future generations to meet their needs in a responsible and equitable manner. Having successfully issued and commercialized over 7.5 million carbon credits across various sectors and technologies, Brundtland has established itself as a leading carbon revenue generation partner in Southern Africa. I'm Emma Reinecke, a sustainability consultant at Brundtland, and I'll be your host for today's episode. I'm joined by Henk Sa, one of our partners and the head of carbon finance. With over 20 years of experience within the carbon industry, Henk brings deep knowledge into how the carbon market is evolving, both in South Africa and globally. We'll be unpacking the state of the carbon market in South Africa over 2 episodes. In part 1, we'll be discussing how the South African carbon market works and what changes we can expect in phase 2 of the carbon tax. Before we dive in, Henk, I've got a quick icebreaker for you. Between the years 2013 and 2023, can you guess how much money was spent developing carbon credit projects around the world?
I would say 5 to 10 billion US dollars.
Try 42 billion US dollars.
Oh, wow.
And 99% of that, or $41 billion, was spent in Asia, the Americas, and sub-Saharan Africa. That's a massive investment in climate infrastructure.
I did not know that. Thank you.
All right, so before we jump into an in-depth discussion of the carbon market, Henk, can you please explain what a carbon credit is and how they work?
Yes, I always see a carbon credit as a sort of formalized recognition of somebody reducing greenhouse gas emissions purposefully, right? The emission of greenhouse gases result in climate change. So to prevent sort of harmful climate change occurring, we want to reduce our emissions. And one of the ways to do that is by monetizing and commercializing these emission reductions. So there's many ways to reduce emissions. And most of them are unintentional and happen when you decide to cycle to work instead of take a car. And a small subset of those rise to the level that they can be claimed as a carbon credit, which is sort of safeguarded by a carbon standard, or carbon standards. And these carbon standards sort of assess the quality of the emission reductions. Once it meets that requirement, they get issued as a carbon credit and then can be used to offset somebody else's emission.
Okay, thank you. And so once a carbon credit is created and issued by one of these carbon standards, it can be traded on a carbon market. Can you give some context for how South Africa's carbon market works?
Yes. So South Africa has like all countries in the world, sort of a plural use of markets for carbon credits. I guess the first bit, which is true in South Africa and globally, is what we call the voluntary carbon market. Say a company or a person would like to be reduce its emission or be net zero or have a product that is net zero, you would buy the amount of carbon credits that equals the footprint of producing your product, and these two would net off against each other and you would be net zero. That's what we call a voluntary use of a carbon credit, the voluntary carbon market. In South Africa, you have although it's not a completely compulsory carbon market, you have what we call a carbon tax, whereby all large industrial emitters pay for their greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. And the system is designed in such a way that you can offset part of those taxable emissions with carbon credits. So although it's not it's not a requirement, it's a possibility to reduce your tax exposure. That carbon market was introduced as a result of the introduction of the South African carbon tax back in 2019. And as a result has given a sort of boost in the arm for the local development of a carbon market.
So South Africa's carbon market has been influenced a lot by the carbon tax. We know that South Africa's carbon tax rates are set to increase over time. Are the increases we're seeing now for the carbon tax rates set in stone, or are they projections?
Well, to some extent they're set in stone. When the tax was introduced in 2019, the headline rate was set at 120 rand per ton of CO2 equivalent emitted. And that has now gone up to 190 rand and will further increase to, I think it is close to 400 rand by 2030. Now that part is legislated. What happens after 2030 has still to be determined by the legislator.
Okay, but what are we thinking is going to happen after 2030?
I assume that the price will go up further. Going from 120 rand per ton to close to 400 rand per ton in about a decade is actually a very steep price increase compared to anything else. The original stated intent by the South African government was, well, we're going to increase the tax rate quite rapidly between 2025 and 2030 to make sure that we catch up with what we think is a reasonable global carbon price, which was then assessed to be somewhere between 10 and $20 per ton, which at that stage was, $20 per ton is about 400 rand. That's the trajectory we're on. Now, two things have happened since then. Globally, the carbon price, the required price of emissions to curb overall emissions worldwide has sort of increased. And the rand has weakened since the original development of that sort of comparison to what the rand global market price would be. So we expect, even though that's not what the legislation says at this moment in time, that after 2030, the carbon price or the carbon tax rate, and as a result, the price of carbon credits will go up further.
At the moment, we're still in the extension of phase 1 of the carbon tax. What updates can we expect in phase 2?
Yeah. Oh, that's an interesting part of it. So originally the first phase ran from 2019 to 2023, which was then extended to 2025, if I'm not mistaken, or the end of 2025. So phase 2 will start at the beginning of 2026 until 2030. And government issued what they call a white paper for phase 2, which had all sorts of ideas in it that I guess did two things. Reduced a bunch of what we call allowances, which are basically discounts on the emissions over which an entity would have to pay tax. And it would increase the offset allowance. So the percentage of your emissions you're allowed to offset, which is the key component that drives the local carbon market.
Okay. Can you explain a little bit more about what the changes are to the allowances?
Yes. The majority of the allowances are related to either, the fact that it was an introduction phase meant that we had an introduction discount. That stays the same at this moment in time. Although in the white paper it was proposed to reduce that introduction allowance, mainly because the introduction phase was over. Having said that, in discussion with industry, it was felt that the economic environment wasn't right to actually reduce that what we call the free allowance component. The other components pretty much stayed the same, except for the carbon budget allowance, which was a discount on the amount of emissions over which you had to pay tax if you would participate on a volunteer basis in the carbon budgeting system, which is a separate government initiative to quantify the amount of emissions different entities within the industry have. Because that 5% of the carbon budget allowance was removed from the discount process of the overall allowances, it created room for an increase for the offset component of the carbon market, which originally was proposed to be increased from what was currently 5 or 10%, depending on what industry you're in, to, I think it was 20 and 25%. Again, that was seen as too excessive in the current economic climate. So that was reduced to an increase from 10 to 15%, which in most cases, for most industry, means actually that there's a doubling of the amount of allowance as well, credits you can use under that allowance.
Okay, so what does that change mean for the carbon market?
So taxpayers buy these credits from project developers who develop these mitigation or emission reduction projects, that the demand for these credits would double from 5% of a tax-paying entity's emissions to 10% of a tax-paying entity's emissions. Or in industries where your offset allowance was already set at 10%, that is now increased to 15%. Long story short, that means that the overall market, the demand for these credits in South Africa, increases by many millions of tons per year.
Wow, that's very interesting. Let's shift gears to COAS. That's the Carbon Offset Administration System, or South Africa's Carbon Credit Registry. What exactly is it and how does it function?
Yes, the COAS system is the national repository for carbon credits that you can use to offset your taxable emissions. If you think about generating a carbon credit, that happens under, in most cases, a global carbon standard, right? You have VCS, the Verified Carbon Standard, or back in the day you had the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism. And these are all standards that issue carbon credits if you meet the criteria set by these standards. And these apply across all 200 countries in the world. To get these to the local South African system, the COAS system, they need to be transferred from that international standard to a local standard. It's a separate process. And in that process, it needs to make sure it meets the criteria set for offsets under the South African carbon tax. Some of these criteria are obviously quite straightforward. It's an instrument to reduce South African emissions. Hence, these emission reduction projects need to be based in South Africa. That's one of the criteria. So it's not possible to import Chinese carbon credits into the system, for example. They need to meet some other specific criteria. One, they cannot be inside of the tax net. Basically, if you are a taxed entity that reduces its emissions, as a result of that, you will pay less carbon tax. If you would then claim carbon credits for those same emission reductions and use those to offset part of your footprint to pay less tax, you're basically reducing the amount of tax payable twice by the same emission reduction. These are a couple of these eligibility criteria to get from an international standard to the COAS system. And once they're in the COAS system, they're transacted between different entities on that COAS system to end up in the possession of an entity that pays tax. And this entity then retires those credits against its tax obligation and as a result pays less carbon tax.
And once you get those credits onto the registry, there's a few different components. Can you talk about the different components of the COAS registry?
Yes. The way we look at it from an analysis point of view is that it has three elements. One is what we call the listing. And this is the bit where they brought into the national registry, into the COAS system from this international carbon standard. These two systems are not linked. So it happens in a way that you cancel them in one system. And with the proof of this cancellation, you get to issue them into the local carbon offset system, which we call listing. This listing happens when you prove that you've canceled them into one standard and via what we call an extended letter of approval, prove that they meet the criteria under the local COAS system. With these two documents and some sort of guiding questions that you need to answer to the COAS system, you are listing these credits onto the system. So that's sort of the income side of the system. Then obviously on the other side, you have the retirement. This is where a taxed entity would retire these credits against its tax obligation. This results in a retirement certificate, which you then as an entity upload on e-filing to SARS and is the basis for paying less carbon tax, basically. Obviously, what sits in between what comes in and what goes out, listing and retirement, is what we call the stockpile, which is basically the credits that are left behind on the system.
Thank you so much. Since COAS launched, what kind of trends have emerged on the COAS system and in the different components?
So there's three components, right? Listing, retirement, and stockpile. We sort of track the volume that flow through the system at these three, buckets moving through the system. And what we've seen from the beginning, 2019, is that the amount of listings was roughly stable around 4 million tons per year. So 4 million tons, 4 million carbon credits. One carbon credit equals 1 ton of CO2 equivalent not emitted to the atmosphere, are moved from an international registry to the COAS system, which we call listing. Then in 2022, we saw a quite drastic drop in the amount of new credits coming onto the system, which we saw to some extent in 2023 recover. On the other side, we saw from when it comes to retirements, we saw a sort of a slow catch up when it comes to retiring in the beginning, where 4 million credits would be listed, but only 3 would be retired, means 1 million remains in the stockpile. And then a couple of years, we saw pretty much what comes in goes out. So whatever is listed on the system is also retired against somebody's tax obligation. In the last year, or actually in the year after that, in 2022, when we saw a drop in listings, we also saw even further drop in retirements, which meant that the stockpile actually shot up and a lot of credits remained on the system in anticipation of what happens next year. That was around the time that government published its first its intention and then the legislation that the carbon tax rate would go up quite drastically from, I think at that stage it was around 140 Rand up to close to 400 Rand in 2030. That means that almost every year the tax rate goes up double digits, which also means that every year the value of these carbon credits go up double digits. So at that stage you get to a position where people that have these carbon credits might decide to hold on to them instead of sell them to somebody who wants to retire them. Or even if you're an entity that would want to retire them against your tax obligation, you might not want to do that in that specific year, but wait until a moment later in time so that you can do it at a much higher rate.
Okay, that's very interesting. If we take a closer look at the supply side of things, what kinds of offset projects do we see generating the most credits in South Africa?
So in the beginning, the bigger volumes came from what we call legacy projects. Projects that were in existence long before the carbon tax was introduced and generated carbon credits into this global voluntary market we mentioned. These were mainly what we call N2O abatement projects. There's a handful of producers of the raw material for fertilizer and explosives in South Africa. And in that production process, you have a lot of emissions of nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is a very potent greenhouse gas. And as a result of that, reducing the amount of N2O emissions will result in a massive amount of carbon credits. So millions of these carbon credits flowed into the system in the early years of the carbon tax, somewhere between 2019 and 2021 and 2022, slowly reducing in value coming in. That has now been replaced by, at this moment in time, the majority of credits come from, cook stove projects, which are basically projects that introduce cook stoves, which result in a much more efficient burning of firewood, which in rural South Africa results in a reduction in deforestation. Right? People cook on firewood. If they do that on open fire, they need a lot more firewood than they would need when they use one of these cook stoves. Hence, the amount of firewood requirement drops, and therefore the amount of deforestation drops. So the retention of these trees is the result of the generation of large volumes of carbon credits. These are historically N2O projects, and currently cook stove projects are the main suppliers of carbon credits into the South African carbon tax market.
Okay, so that's the supply side of things. And if we turn to the demand side, who's actually buying these credits?
Yeah, good question. So if we take a step back, South Africa roughly has a national footprint of about 500 million tons of CO2 equivalent emitted every year. The vast majority of those are emitted by Eskom, our national utility. Let's say that's about 200 to 250 million tons. The second largest emitter is Sasol, which is somewhere around 27 to 40 million tons per year of emissions. As Eskom is a state-owned entity, although it's technically included in the carbon tax, it effectively does not pay carbon tax and is therefore also not effectively in the market for carbon tax offsets, making Sasol by far the largest active buyer into the carbon tax offset market. This is then followed by, I guess, your usual suspects, everybody in the mining sector, everybody in all smelters, cement companies, and those kind of sort of large rudimentary industrial processes. They tend to have large carbon footprints and therefore are subject to the carbon tax and therefore are in the market for buying carbon credits.
Okay, so you've covered supply and demand. Let's turn to policy. Under the Paris Agreement, every country which is a party has to submit nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, every 5 years, which outline their emission reduction trajectories. Each NDC needs to be more ambitious than the last. South Africa submitted its first NDC and updated it, but we're still waiting on the second one. How does this first NDC influence South Africa's carbon market?
I think it influences the carbon market in two ways. One, the NDC is set for the 2025-2030 period currently, and the highest level of emissions allowed under the NDC is 510 million tons, and that was in 2025. And we're now on our way to 420 million tons by 2030, which means that actually from the beginning of this year, according to the NDC, we're in the first year that the country reduces its emissions in line with its global obligations. If that is the case, we'll have to see. But at least when it comes to its stated intention in its NDC, that's what happened. I think for the future, especially when you say, well, we're going to get to net zero by 2050, and that your next NDC has to be more stringent, more ambitious than the last one. You have basically an anchor from which you can have all sorts of policies that try to realize that objective. The government has indicated on several occasions that the carbon tax is the tip of the spear. It's their main instrument to curb South Africa's emissions downwards. That also means that if you want to be more ambitious after 2030, you will need to do that you would need to update the carbon tax in such a way that contributes to that objective. At this moment in time, the country is below its NDC, which is exactly how it's supposed to function.
Okay, so what do these changes in the emissions reduction trajectory mean for demand on the carbon market?
I guess it means two things. One is assuming that the reduction in emissions towards net zero in 2050, following the NDC trajectory, you would need a higher carbon tax, and therefore offsets under the carbon tax systems will become more expensive, and demand will increase as a result of that. The opposite of the coin is that the NDC is the footprint of the entire country. And these carbon credits come from instances there where emissions are reduced. Right? So you first need emissions before you can have emission reductions. If the overall number of emissions in the country has reduced, that means the potential to generate carbon credits has also reduced. So in essence, the demand will increase, except for the fact that the overall footprint has decreased, and therefore the overall demand sort of decreases as well.
I see. Okay, so we know demand is largely driven by policy, but supply depends on the private sector. Is that right?
That's completely correct, yeah. So the supply side it's a project-based mechanism, right? So these are all emission reduction projects, whereby a company decides to install solar panels on their roof instead of using a diesel generator or fossil fuel-based grid electricity. That emission reduction between we use the same electricity, but not from the grid or from a generator, but from a clean source like PV panels. The difference in emissions you would claim as carbon credits. That is a pure private sector initiative. It is a private entity that installs these solar panels, and it is a private entity that converts the emission reductions from those solar panels into carbon credits. All of these different activities, because this is just one example, right? You can also have a project where, as we talk about, we can hand out cook stoves to people. That reduces the amount of deforestation in the country, and that results in the generation of carbon credits. These are all private sector initiatives, which result in the generation of a wide spectrum of different carbon credit projects.
So Brundtland has forecasted various carbon tax offset or CTO demand and supply scenarios. In the next episode, we'll discuss those projections in detail. But for now, can you give us an idea of what's expected in terms of the supply of CTOs in the carbon market?
I think generally speaking, there's two types of supply that we include in the modeling. One is the supply we know, sort of the supply that's coming down the pipe, right? Project registered under different carbon standards, projects that are already operational, projects that are already issuing carbon credits into the system. And then we can see projects that are not yet at that stage, either from a project development point of view or from a carbon credit development point of view, but we can see coming down the pipe. And we look at sort of three groupings of project types from which we know are eligible as offsets under the carbon tax. First one being renewable energy projects. Within limitations, they are eligible as offsets under the system, as long as the majority of the electricity in South Africa is still generated by fossil fuel. Those would be interesting mitigation opportunities. Option number two, component number two would be anything else related to the carbon intensive energy infrastructure that we have in South Africa. So all types of energy efficiency assessments on the electricity grid, but also energy efficiency from a steam generation or other coal or fossil fuel use. This includes fuel switching from using fossil fuels to biomass and stuff like that. The third component we look at is from what we call natural climate solutions, which include the cook stove project we spoke about and other projects that either reduce the amount of emissions in the natural environment, or sequester carbon from the atmosphere into the natural environment. This can be by afforestation projects, right? We grow trees that absorb carbon and store it in that new forest. Or changing agricultural practices that result in an increase in carbon soil. So the carbon that is stored underground in the soil instead of in the atmosphere in the form of CO2.
And that brings us to the end of today's conversation. A big thank you to Henk for sharing his insights on the state of the carbon market, and a big thank you to our listeners for tuning in. Today, we learned what a carbon credit is, how South Africa's carbon registry COAS works, and what the expected outcomes are for the upcoming changes to the carbon tax rates and allowance. We also learned that South Africa's carbon tax is a key tool for achieving South Africa's net zero targets and influencing the demand side of the local carbon market, which is set to grow in the coming years. In our next episode, we will continue our conversation with Henk as we take a closer look at how the South African carbon market is expected to evolve, particularly on the demand and supply side of carbon credits. In the meantime, please be sure to leave a review or share this episode to grow our community. You can also learn more about our work by visiting our website, www.brundtland.co.za, or following our LinkedIn page. For business enquiries, please contact us via email at info@brundtland.co.za or telephonically on 011 4477 892, and we'd be happy to discuss potential ways for collaboration. Catch you next time!